The first thing to say is when I'm reading a piece of work, I start to formulate and narrow my idea about how good this piece of work is right from the very start. So when I pick up a paper, I'm looking at the title. And so when I look at the title, I'm thinking to myself, well, is this title narrowed? Like, is it a title that could be for a very specific study, or is it really broad and maybe even just the title that I gave for the whole assessment? So my title for the assessment was the effect of diseases on cardiorespiratory fitness, or something like that. I'd expect your title to be much narrower than that, because you selected the disease, you selected a particular variable of interest maybe, or topic of interest within that disease. So your title should be much more specific than that. And straight away, subconsciously, I'm making a judgment about where this paper is going to go, because I'm thinking, okay, what disease are we talking about? What variables are we talking about? Maybe why are we talking about those variables? Right from the very start. And so you want to make sure your title is really clear and actually accurately reflects what you've done in your piece of work. The next thing we go on to would be your abstract. So the first thing I'm looking at with an abstract is, have you done an abstract? Because I've mentioned it several times before, it's in the guidelines, but you won't have done it in other assessments potentially. So I'm looking to see whether have you actually done an abstract, because that tells me a little bit about your engagement with the module. And so with an abstract, all we're looking for is the bare bones of the study. So, a sentence or two sentences which just highlight the rationale and objectives of the paper. A methods section which is just really focusing on those elements of PCOS. So who is the population? What's what study protocols did you use? What were your outcome markers that you measured, and how did you measure them? And then maybe a single line about the statistical analysis that you conducted. Then look at the results, and just after the primary results, so what were the main findings from your study? And I'd expect to see them, I'd expect to see the actual results, maybe the p-values associated with them. And then finally, I'm looking for a sentence or two sentences which just conclude the whole paper, and that's it. So it's probably going to be 10 to 15, maybe 20 sentences in total, and it's just highlighting the real most important parts of each section of your paper. And so by now, even though it's only say 200, 250 words, I've now got a good gauge on what you've done, because your abstract tells me about kind of why you've done the study, really shortly, what methods you've used, have you been able to pick out those key components of the methods, what the key results were, and how you've interpreted those key results. So I'm already thinking, is this piece of work more likely to be 2.2 and above, or is it more likely to be a 2.2 and below? And so that was already started to formulate in my head. Then we move on to the introduction. And the introduction I'm not going to go through, because essentially it's what I've just told you about. I'm expecting an introduction to the area that narrows in focus, that results in a nice clear rationale, and then an aim that kind of meets that rationale, allows you to sort of test the question that you've raised. By the time I've got to the end of the introduction, I've got a good sense of where this work is. So it can change. It does change. I've still got my GBA grid next to me. I'm still thinking about that. But, by now I know whether you understand the topic area that you're looking at, how much literature you've looked at, and whether you've been able to, concisely reflect the literature. I can see whether you've been able to construct a nice, clear, thread of information that results in a rationale. I can see how you're citing. So I've got a good sense at this point. Then we go into the methods. And again, in the same way as I said for the abstract, the methods are all about those key elements. So who's your population? What did you do? Can you explain what we did in the lab? Can you remember? Did you take down notes? Were you there? Were you able to accurately reflect that back to me? What are your outcome variables, and how were they measured? And then some statistical analysis, which should include, normality testing. And then there's certain type of statistic that you did based on the results of those normality tests. All stuff that we did in previous seminars. And so now we're already halfway through the paper, and there'll be no paper that I've read up to the methods where I'm thinking this is a 2-1 that ends up being a third. It just doesn't really happen like that. So, I've got a really, really good idea about this paper. Now I'm looking for justification more like, well, is it a 2-2? Is it a 2-1? Or could it actually be a first? That's my boundary. By the time I've read the methods, that's narrowed even further. So the methods are just, have you represented the results that you've said that you've measured? Have you represented them well in terms of have you chosen the correct type of figure, or the correct or used a table where necessary? Have you written the results in the text in a way that's makes it easy to read? Have you included units? Have you included your F values, P values? Have you T statistics rather than F values for T tests? Have you provided titles for your figure and for your table? Just all bog standard stuff that you should be doing that makes it easy for me to understand what you found. And then again, just to reiterate, by this point, after the results section, I know where your results sit at that point. Like I know whether it's a 2-1 or a 2 or a first, whether it's a 2-1 or a 2-2. Like in that bracket, there's still room to improve. There's still room for it to move down, but really, really narrow by that point. I'm not seeing a paper that's a 2-1 or say a first, let's say, for, past the results that ends up being a low 2-2. Very rarely happens because the majority of the work has been done, and I can see that you understand what you're talking about. Then we get into the discussion. What am I expecting? First bit, main findings. Then I'm expecting this in the next sections to really get into the question that you posed in your introduction. So, if you posed a question like comparing VVCO2 across the populations, well, I want you to show me your, describe your results and then be comparing them with previous studies to see how they kind of alter the literature base, if you like. So, if we've got 3 papers that all show that VVCO2 is a higher in people with COPD, but you've not found that, then I would expect you to try and explain why that might be the case. And I would expect you to do that for the different variables whilst thinking about how they relate to one another. Then as you move towards the bottom of the discussion section, I'd like you to think about how it relates to the real world. So like, what does this now change? So if you found something that's different, then how might that impact the real world? Will it impact guidelines? Would it impact how you might advice that might be given to patients? Something like that. And then it's expecting strengths and limitations of your paper. So, why is your paper good? How could it be improved? Within the limitations, one of the most important things is that you just don't say that something hasn't been done. Ideally, a limitation should be why something that's not been done, why that's important that it's not been done, so why does that mean something, and then if possible and where required, including literature to support that. So for example, it might be that you say that the study had low subject numbers. And if you wanted to say that on its own, that's kind of a weak limitation. But if you were to say has low subject numbers, a previous study, maybe a statistical based study had shown that subject numbers, that this is required to see these types of differences. So it's like, so what you're saying is there's a limitation, this is why it's a problem, and then you're providing justification using previous literature to state why that to justify that it is a problem. So it's sort of a 3-pronged attack, if you like. This isn't as good as it should be. This is why, and here's the reference that proves this is why. And then finally, a concluding sentence, a concluding paragraph, which just rounds off the whole piece of work. Don't omit this towards the end. If you start to become short of time, it's really important that you round off your piece of work. And then obviously, bibliography with all the references that you cited in the text previously. So that's quite a lot of information, but most of it, hopefully, you'll be kind of aware of. I suppose the main thing that I'm trying to get across to you is just this idea that, you need to start doing things well from the start. Each section needs to be as strong as possible. Like, you can't think that just because you've never done an abstract before that it's not important. It is, because I'm going to be judging, and thinking about your understanding of your work right from the very start. Similarly with the concluding paragraph, just because it comes at the end and you're restating things that have already been said, it doesn't mean it's not important, because that's the part of the work that's going to show me whether you're able to bring all the elements of the study and really make a strong conclusion about what your paper has added. So all the bits are really important. Like I said, from what I've read from the people that have submitted things to me so far, everybody's doing pretty well. It's just going to be about using the next week and a half just to kind of refine what you've done and try and make your paragraphs a little bit stronger, your sections a little bit stronger, and then going through and having those checklists to make sure you're not making any silly mistakes, like not putting titles, figures, and tables, making sure you've got units for everything, making sure you're presenting the right way, all that sort of stuff, which you can definitely do, but sometimes when you become a bit time limited, you might forget to do it. So making sure you go through those processes, you're not losing easy marks. Okay, I hope that helps. And if you have any questions based on this, then you can email me, or and then any of the ones that keep coming up, I will post on the Q&A section of the Now page. See you later.